again, everyone. This is Sunday School class with Ricky, and I am Ricky Williams. Welcome back to our study on the book of Esther. This is lesson 2 in our study. In our first lesson, we looked at the historical setting of the book of Esther and some of its unique features. We learned that although the name of God never appears in the story, His providence seems to guide every event. Today, we begin with chapter 1. But before we look at the events themselves, I would like to spend a few minutes discussing the king at the center of the story, King Ahasuerus. So before we begin, a quick reminder that if you like these types of lessons, this type of content, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so already, and also please like and share the video. Okay, let's go on now. Esther chapter 1. I know that history isn't everyone's favorite topic, but bear with me for a few minutes. We'll start with a little bit of history. Let's study together. So who was this King Ahasuerus? Most modern scholars identify the biblical Ahasuerus with the king Xerxes I, who ruled the Persian Empire from approximately 486 to 465 BC. His Persian name was Yarsha, which became Xerxes in Greek and Ahasuerus in Hebrew. He inherited an enormous empire from his father Darius I. The Persian Empire stretched from India in the east to Ethiopia in the south. The capital city of the empire was Susa, also called Shushan, where much of our story in the book of Esther takes place. Xerxes is remembered by historians as a powerful ruler, but also a man of great pride, immense wealth, and sometimes impulsive decisions. The Greek historian Herodotus describes him as an ambitious and determined king, determined to expand the Persian Empire even further. That ambition brings us to one of the great conflicts of ancient history, the Greco-Persian Wars. Let's start with the First Greco-Persian War. The conflict between Persia and the Greek city-states began during the reign of Xerxes' father, Darius I. Greek cities in Asia Minor had rebelled against Persian rule and received assistance from Athens. Darius sought to punish the Greeks and extend Persian control into mainland Greece. In 490 BC, the Persian army landed near the town of Marathon. They were met there by a much smaller Athenian force. Against all expectations, the Greeks won a remarkable victory, and the Battle of Marathon became one of the most famous battles in history. According to tradition, a messenger ran approximately 26 miles from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory before collapsing from exhaustion. Today, the modern marathon race commemorates that legendary run. For Persia, however, Marathon was an embarrassment that demanded revenge. Darius intended to launch another invasion, but he died before he could do so. And so, the responsibility for this passed to his son, Xerxes. Now we come to the Second Greco-Persian War. So after becoming king, Xerxes spent several years preparing for what would become one of the largest military campaigns in the ancient world. This brings us to an interesting possibility in the book of Esther, because Esther chapter 1 tells us that in the 3rd year of his reign, the king gathered his princes, nobles, military commanders, and officials from throughout the entire empire. The gathering lasted for 180 days. Now, the Bible does not tell us exactly why this meeting took place, but it is possible that this may have been a great planning conference for Xerxes' coming invasion of Greece. The timing certainly fits. Now, during this period, Xerxes was organizing his troops and resources from across his empire. So although we cannot prove that this was the purpose of the gathering, it is a reasonable historical possibility. If this interpretation is correct, then the banquet described in Esther Chapter 1 was connected to one of the greatest military expeditions in history. A few years later, Xerxes marched into Greece, or maybe he sailed into Greece, with an enormous army. Herodotus tells us that the Persian army was about 1 million men, but most experts today consider that to be a slight exaggeration and believe the number was closer to maybe 30 or 40,000 men. Still, a very large number. One of the most famous events of that campaign was the Battle of Thermopylae, which occurred in 480 BC. A small Greek force of about 300 men, led by King Leonidas of Sparta, defended a narrow mountain pass against the much larger Persian army. Although the Spartans were ultimately defeated, their courage became legendary. You may have heard the phrase used, the 300 Spartans, and it comes from this battle, as does the movie 300, which I'm sure many of you have seen at the cinema or on TV or something, but a very well-known movie based on this war with this king, Xerxes I. Eventually, though, Xerxes did manage to capture and burn Athens. However, later that same year, the Persian navy suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Salamis. The following year, the Persian land forces were defeated at Plataea, effectively ending the invasion. Many historians believe that after these military setbacks, Xerxes returned to Susa in defeat and devoted himself to palace life and building projects. Some scholars have noted that Esther Chapter 2, where a search begins for a new queen, may fit naturally after these disappointing military campaigns. Now, let's look at the events of the chapter itself. The story opens with King Ahasuerus reigning over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. The author wants us to understand the enormous power and wealth of the Persian Empire. In the third year of his reign, the king hosts a great banquet for his officials and military leaders, as we discussed earlier. The celebration lasts for 180 days. At the end of this period, the king holds another feast lasting for 7 days for all the people in the palace complex at Shushan. The description is extravagant. There are white and blue curtains, marble pillars, couches of gold and silver, mosaic pavements, and royal wine served in golden vessels. The writer emphasizes the incredible wealth of the Persian court. At the same time, Queen Vashti holds a separate banquet for the women of the royal palace. This detail reminds us that in those days, sometimes men and women often celebrated separately in that ancient Persian society. On the seventh day, after drinking much wine, the king commands that Queen Vashti be brought before the guests wearing her royal crown. The text does not clearly state the king's intentions. Some believe he simply wanted to display her beauty. Others think he intended to humiliate her before the drunken crowd. Whatever the reason, Queen Vashti refuses to come. Her refusal enrages the king. The king consults his wise men and legal advisors. One of them, Memucan, argues that Vashti's actions will encourage women throughout the empire to disrespect their husbands. So the king's solution is drastic. Vashti should be removed as queen and another woman chosen in her place. A royal decree is then issued throughout the entire empire, declaring that every man should be master in his own household. Now, to us modern readers, the decree may seem almost humorous or even frivolous. A domestic disagreement in the palace becomes an empire-wide political issue. Yet, it also reveals the insecurity of absolute power. The ruler of the largest empire in the world at the time cannot compel obedience from his own queen. So there are some very important spiritual lessons in this chapter. Firstly, we see that earthly power is limited. Ahasuerus ruled 127 provinces, yet he could not control the decisions of one individual, his wife. Human authority has limits. Secondly, we see that pride often leads to foolish decisions. The chapter is filled with displays of wealth, prestige, and power. The king's pride and anger ultimately lead him to make rash decisions. Of course, the Bible frequently warns against the dangers of pride. Thirdly, as we've continued to emphasize in the book so far, we learn that God is working even when he is not mentioned. Although God is absent from the chapter by name, the events are setting the stage for his hidden purposes. If Vashti had not refused the king, Esther would never have eventually become queen. What appears to be a palace dispute will eventually become the means by which an entire people are saved. And then we see that ordinary events can have extraordinary consequences. A banquet, an argument, and a royal decree may seem insignificant, yet these events become part of a much larger story. The book of Esther reminds us that God often works through the ordinary circumstances of life. As we close today's lesson, consider this. The story in this chapter about Queen Vashti reminds us that throughout much of human history, women have often been expected to submit to the wishes of those in power, sometimes at the expense of their own dignity and conscience. Many have found themselves in situations where refusing an unjust demand results in punishment, rejection, or loss. Whatever we may think of Vashti's motives, Esther Chapter 1 presents a woman who chose not to comply with the king's command and who suffered severe consequences for that decision. Her story invites us to reflect on the importance of respecting the humanity and the agency of every person. And it reminds us that true greatness is not found in the exercise of power over others, but in treating one another with honor, dignity, and justice. Chapter 1 introduces us to a powerful king who believes he controls an empire. But as the story progresses, we will discover that another hand is quietly guiding history. In our next lesson, we will look at Esther Chapter 2, and we'll see how a young Jewish woman living in exile is unexpectedly brought into the royal palace and placed in a position that will change the course of history. I trust you will join us then for that lesson. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our continued journey through the book of Esther. I will see you in our next class. Until then, God bless you.